You're listening to Big Table, a podcast about books and conversation presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles. I'm your host, JC Gabel. For each episode, we speak to one author about a singular book in a long-form interview. Each interview is then followed by a brief reading, sometimes from the same book being discussed, sometimes by a like-minded title and a different author. But every episode does retain a loose theme throughout, and is inspired by the work of radio host and oral historian Studs Terkel. Thanks for listening. Sun Ra, aka Sonny Blount, enjoyed a wildly original cosmic existence for a half-century as the otherworldly performer and composer that he was. Along with his orchestra, as they came to be known, Ra built a space-age swing band that soared to new heights in the post-war years of Chicago, where he relocated from his native Alabama in the late 1940s. Rooted in the jazz tradition but open to new musical explorations, Ra fused science fiction motifs with blues, Latin dance music, pop exotica, philosophy. Many of these traits would later be called Afrofuturism. And he did it with a neo-Egyptian interstellar cosmology, famously claiming to be from the planet Saturn. Enter writer, historian, and university professor William Seitz, whose fabulous new book, Sun Ra Chicago, Afrofuturism and the City, published by the University of Chicago Press, charts Ra's 3 decades ascension to new musical cosmos and beyond. Seitz argues quite convincingly that the deep utopian engagement Ra felt in Chicago in the mid-20th century presented a way to see new possibilities of urban life for Black creative communities. Along with fellow New South City transplant Alton Abraham, Ra not only gigged as a composer, band leader, and keyboard player, but Abraham and him were also entrepreneurs and innovators. Together, the two formed El Saturn, a company that supported various projects from producing records and designing objects to finding local gigs for Ra and his orchestra. El Saturn's hybrid nature, equal parts musical collective, small business, community organization, and cultural laboratory, gave the company a barely sustainable path to grow, but a lot of creative freedom. And yet, even after Ra left Chicago in the late 70s for the East Coast, the ethos he formed among his brethren can still be felt in his orchestra's performances today, nearly 30 years after his death in 1993 at the age of 79. I caught up with Seitz earlier this year after devouring this hybrid social history musical studies tome to Sun Ra. Having grown up in Chicago, I've long been a fan of Ra and his orchestra, and I started in with the impetus to write a social history book built around Ra. Here's William Seitz. As a sociologist and as a professor, how did you stumble upon the music of Sun Ra initially, and what led to the impetus of this book in particular?
Well, I've always been for a long time, was a fan of the music, but I was trained as an urban sociologist, and I've always thought historically about how cities evolve and change, and especially about questions of community. So questions like, how should we understand community life in cities like New York and Chicago? In particular, life in working class communities and communities of color that are often defined as some problem communities or as disorganized, marginal areas that are defined really by what they're not. And as a scholar of such communities, I'm very interested in the capacities of local community actors to do things like build neighborhood attachments, institutions, to develop solidarities among themselves, to define for themselves how they respond to broader changes in the city, and in the case of Sun Ra and his colleagues, even to collaborate together in ways that create new kinds of imaginings of the city and the possibilities of Black life in the future. So my first book, which is called Remaking New York, focused quite differently on anti-gentrification, community activism in New York's Lower East Side during the 1980s and 90s. And a lot of my work has theorized about different traditions of community organizing and development. What I've always been sort of uncomfortable about, though, is that a lot of important and interesting community work isn't really seen as community work, often because it doesn't label itself as that, but also, I think, because it isn't seen as practical, as concrete, as legible. And I think, historically, this is especially true in African American communities, where scholars sometimes use very established categories for understanding community work and for understanding Black urban life more generally. So, for example, there are community organizations and there are churches, and we have sort of ready-made inherited images for what both of those look like. Or, there are schools, and we know what they do, or at least what they're supposed to do. And then over here there are bars, there's taverns, music joints, nightclubs, and we know what goes on there too. And what became so interesting to me about Sun Ra, as I lived longer in Chicago and became more familiar with South Side history especially, is that Sun Ra's life in Chicago seemed to traverse and complicate those tidy notions about, community structure, purpose, and order. So, I was already for a long time interested in his music, but as I discovered how central the city of Chicago was, both to, his musical development, but also his philosophical development, and also how central Birmingham, Alabama was, both to his development, but also to his experience of Chicago, he being born in Birmingham and spent his first 33 years there. After recognizing that, I came to feel that reconstructing his urban life could tell us a lot, not only about him, but also about, something new about urban community building in 20th century American cities. In particular, tell us something about what I call critical utopian community building, which is, to my mind at least, a way of thinking that undergirds a lot of what we now know as Afrofuturism.
I guess until I read your book, I hadn't realized that a lot of time was spent in Birmingham developing his music, and that eventually after the war, he'd kind of reached a point where he felt blocked. And that's when he picks up and moves to Chicago. And of course, this aligns with the Great Migration years. I didn't realize how that duopoly of growing up in the South and then coming to Chicago really helped form the sensibility that you just described. And also the company they formed, El Saturn, which was really more than a record label. It was almost like a movement, it seems.
Yeah, I think that, you mentioned the Great Migration, and that was really sort of my entry point in a lot of ways for taking seriously, the relationship between Sun Ra's experience in Birmingham and then his work in Chicago. And, I think that, the dominant image we have of the Great Migration is as a rural to urban migration, right? Folks in the South left a sharecropping life and then had their first encounter with urban America in Chicago. But as you said, Sun Ra came from Birmingham. It was a major metropolis in the early 20th century South. He'd already had a music career there, as did many of the other musicians who came to Chicago in the late 1940s. When he came, they came from southern cities and had careers there. And so, for me, understanding Sun Ra's development and more generally kind of South Side Chicago musical culture of the period of the 1940s and 50s meant looking more deeply at sort of early 20th century Birmingham, and really what I found was a city, I think, whose own paradoxes tell us a lot about Sun Ra's own early sensibilities as a musician and a thinker. And I try to get inside those in the book. You know, I think for most Northerners, when you mention Birmingham, the typical image is, you know, Bull Connor and fire hoses and vicious dogs being set on civil rights protesters in the 1960s. And those, you know, those images are rightly powerful, and they do sort of begin to capture some of the extraordinary violence of white supremacy and segregation that was, embedded so deeply in Birmingham. But what they don't, I think, begin to suggest is the extraordinary richness of black urban culture there, and especially musical culture. And, Sun Ra was born there in 1916. His birth name was Herman Poole Blount, or Sonny Blount, as he came to be called. And he grew up not just in Birmingham, but in downtown Birmingham. His grandmother's house was right in the sort of commercial district of Birmingham. And Birmingham, at the time, was what people called a New South city, which really meant it developed as an industrial city quite late, at the end of the 1800s. It grew within the space of 2 decades into one of the largest and most economically dynamic cities in the South, including the largest black population in the South, who were workers in the mines, in the mills, in convict labor, and all sorts of other places. So, Birmingham was rigidly, brutally segregated by law. Black people couldn't vote like white people. They couldn't eat where white people ate. They couldn't sit in parks where whites could. And they could only shop at their own separate downtown, which sat right next to the white downtown. But one consequence of this extreme level of segregation was a certain cultural autonomy. And this created the space for black people in Birmingham to build remarkably developed community institutions, schools, fraternal orders, societies, clubs, all sorts of associations that, among many other things, supported the city's intensely vibrant musical culture. So everything from, ragtime, jazz, swing, spirituals, the blues, and you name it. And, I think along with this musical culture came, and this was very much absorbed by the young Sonny Blount, came a certain notion of black cultural leadership and racial autonomy. And his sort of immersion in that very much shaped his early thinking. By the time he was in his 20s, he was already leading his own swing band. They called them territory bands because they traveled constantly throughout towns and small cities throughout the Southeast Territory. Then he quit, and he withdrew to his grandmother's house downtown and gradually started to create what we would now call a kind of musical salon, where musicians would drop by, they would rehearse, they would hang out, they would, listen to his theories about race and outer space and the future, which he was starting to share with people. And, so what I emphasize about his Birmingham life and the kinds of ideas he was developing is that, as eccentric as they might seem, they did reflect certain cultural characteristics of Birmingham itself. That Birmingham, a city which is a hyper-modern, dynamic city focused on the future, the New South city, but also a city where the possibility of racial autonomy can be taken seriously, at least in the cultural realm. Birmingham also had a very strange mixture of its kind of religious culture and its commercial culture. We see this also when Sun Ra gets to Chicago as being very much, the kind of boundaries that he traversed back and forth across. So when I'm trying to understand his life in Chicago, I'm imagining him carrying some of this Southern urban culture with him when he goes north in 1946. And I think it helped me see South Side Chicago culture of that late 40s, 1950s period as having its own sort of paradoxes, particularly the Black South Side, where on the one hand you've got deep disappointment and frustration at Northern Jim Crow, all the expectations that Black Northerners had coming out of the war, the World War II period, for expectations for equality and integration, and they all seemed to ring increasingly hollow as the post-war period continued. On the other hand, Black Chicago had surprisingly utopian currents running through it, and it was really by following Sun Ra kind of in his everyday life that I started to recognize those. We see it most clearly in the sort of musically in the sort of extraordinary kind of jazz and rhythm and blues scene that emerges in the city, or kind of reemerges in the city. But we also see it in this sort of explosion of South Side religious heterodoxy. In other words, you've got faiths like the Black Israelites and Muslim Science Temple and the Nation of Islam. All of these religious groups are becoming very active. They're growing. They're hanging out in Washington Park on Chicago's South Side, and they're all offering new theories about the historical origins of Black Americans in Africa or in the Orient or in Ethiopia. And they're all offering theories about, the kind of the future of our time. And Sun Ra, as well as his friend and eventual business partner, Alton Abraham, who also came from the New South, the urban New South, in his case, Texarkana, Texas, they become deeply involved in this Washington Park world and this kind of heterodox religious world, and they develop their own theories and their own commentaries, their own origin hypotheses. And what links these, there's a bunch of fascinating writings that they produced that usually go by the name of the polemical broadsheets. And these writings become really a way for these men to reimagine Black identity and the possibilities of what it might mean to be Black in America. And so these ideas very much animate Sun Ra and Alton Abraham by the mid-1950s, once they begin to form a musical ensemble, the orchestra, and they create as well a whole kind of community-based cultural enterprise called El Saturn, which, in addition to being a record label, also, brings together local artists and illustrators and kind of creates a kind of a cultural, a rather strange, but still quite well-known and visible kind of cultural milieu that both kind of embraces some of the more spiritual, religiously oriented theories of the community and its musical kind of spaces as well.
One thing you unpacked in the book, which I was happy to see, was I always was curious where Sun Ra came up with this notion of being from Saturn, and that whole philosophy he sort of developed about the otherworldliness of his music and his writings. You reveal that it originally came in the form of a dream that he had. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because I think part of his myth is sort of rooted in that otherworldly idea.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this, this idea of space travel, which does become really central to, Sun Ra's persona and his kind of music, his musical presentation and his philosophy. This has a long history in, not just kind of in Black cultural history, but really in Western civilization. This idea of, space travel as a kind of as a spiritual way to transcend the indignities and the oppressions and the barrenness of real life on Earth. And so, we see this in a lot of religious philosophies, from the Enlightenment onward. And it's also a big theme in what we, I think, only from the vantage point of today, recognize as a certain kind of a proto-Afrofuturist sensibility that we see in certain 19th century black intellectuals and activists and writers, folks like Martin Delaney. It comes up in different ways, but some of them also kind of commit to paper kind of their own dreams of travel, of flight, in some ways it's about flight to Africa and sort of magical ways to kind of traverse the globe and connect or reconnect with one's origins, but in a new place. And so, that becomes a really kind of powerful trope within, a certain kind of black proto-Afrofuturist culture. And then Sun Ra, really in some ways takes it to another level by, on the one hand, kind of increasingly embracing, the story of being from Saturn as a literal story, that I am not of this world. And so therefore, I can see things that you mere mortals cannot see. And one of the things that I can see is that, that this real life, this life that you have on Earth is a myth. It's an illusion. And in some ways that, politically and socially, that's a really powerful statement to make, particularly for an African-American man in a place like, Jim Crow Birmingham, where to disavow the reality of this level of racial segregation and white supremacy that confronts everyone and that regulates daily life is seen by some people as crazy, is seen by some people as unbelievably daring, and it's seen by him as, and at least is presented as by him as a kind of a statement, simply a factual statement that's true. And his ability to kind of inhabit that narrative and to sort of flesh it out over the course of his career and to make it part of, not just his kind of musical and performative persona on stage, but also to make it a part of kind of his identity, his core identity, and his band members and colleagues as well, to kind of embrace that. That becomes a way of, in some ways, realizing this old Magic City dream of kind of, instead of it being kind of the city on a hill or the city within the city, which is our city, it's another world that is our world. And that becomes, we see this, as a very common kind of theme in Afrofuturist culture today. It's what, is what enables, that kind of cultural form to both have a vision of the future, but one which pulls along with it an origin story about where where Black people come from and the richness of the culture that they take with them into the new world that is theirs.
Until I read your book, I hadn't thought past, just the stage ensemble and the theatricality of Sun Ra. But I think after reading your book, I realized that this was trying to transcend, the doldrums of the time, Jim Crow, Northern racism, Southern racism. So Sun Ra leaves, and they eventually end up, I think, in Philadelphia, right, after New York?
That's right. That's right.
But yet Alton stays in Chicago and continues to crank out tons of stuff and ends up kind of being the arbiter of all of this material that then ends up at the University of Chicago. And I know John Corbett had some hand in that being placed there. My sense is this must have been a really fun book for you to research and write, because a lot of it was close to home, where you teach and where you live. But also there just seemed to be an awful lot of stuff that was kept. Sun Ra was incredibly prolific in so many different ways that stuff was, I think, better preserved than most musicians. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there was. First of all, yes, there was and is a ton of stuff. So it's a large collection of material. But to sort of call it like, you know, an archive or collection in its original state, you know, I think as John Corbett tells the story, you know, it was basically just he got a call saying, you know, people are emptying out Alton Abraham's old house in Chicago and they're throwing all the stuff in the garbage. Are you interested? You know, you should come get it. And, you know, it was just what it was essentially a mess of a lifetime of accumulated stuff. But, and then to your point, fascinating stuff that, you know, as a historian, you find extraordinarily valuable, in part because it hasn't already been curated or self-curated, right, in a way that a lot of, I think, artists treat their own materials. Or at least another way to put it was that they were already curated, but in the inimitable kind of Sun Ra, Alton Abraham way, in which there was some kind of system of organization that could still be visible, but it wasn't exactly clear what it was or what it meant. And so, you know, absolutely, it was enormous fun and a real kind of privilege to be able to have access to this material and to have it so close to home. And yet at the same time, it presents a real challenge because, just for one example, on the one hand, there are these polemical broadsheets, which are kind of like religious commentaries and, as you say, kind of fairly cryptic ruminations on how one might come to grips with being black in America, in Chicago, in the early 1950s. On the other hand, there was an enormous amount of music, recorded music, and compositions, and illustrations, and extraordinarily rich materials there. It wasn't immediately clear how those different pieces connected with each other. And I think for me, figuring out a way to read the polemical broadsheets in the context of the sort of urban scene in Chicago in the late 40s and 50s, and also in light of Sun Ra's own history in Birmingham, helped me begin to see better what Sun Ra and Alton too were trying to do with their music, so that the sort of what's often a kind of gap between the music and then sort of the philosophy. Instead of that gap, you start to see kind of points of connection. I think, to my mind at least, it made me feel like I got closer to what Ra and Abraham were trying to accomplish through this kind of cultural experiment that was El Saturn, and that was sort of visible through all these artifacts in the collection.
There is some connective tissue between the Chicago 60s and 70s and I guess all the way into the 90s avant-garde, because I saw some of these. You know, I used to live in the South Loop and would walk down to the Velvet Lounge when Fred Anderson was still alive, and there were still some shards of that South Side world even when I was growing up. But it seemed as if Sun Ra hadn't left with the orchestra, that, you know, by the mid-60s, the avant-garde scene in Chicago really was on the rise. And I know it was, you know, really a financial situation that drove them out of the city. But then we have the Art Ensemble of Chicago and Von Freeman and Fred Anderson, and all of that kind of comes not that far later. And I feel like they're in many ways antecedents to what Ra was doing. And do you see it that way?
Yeah, this is a really interesting kind of component, I think, of Sun Ra's Chicago experience. And it's also become kind of a little bit, I would say, a point of controversy in terms of how it's viewed. I think that you mentioned the Art Ensemble of Chicago and some of the other musicians who came to prominence in the 1960s Chicago avant-garde. All of them, or many of them, connected with the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, the AACM. For a lot of those musicians, they have different views among themselves on how important Sun Ra's music was to them and how important his sort of example was. Because what's fascinating is that so many of them, heard him play when they were growing up in 1950 Chicago. Some of them actually played with him, though few of them were actually full-fledged members of the orchestra. They I think for me, one of the most interesting things was seeing kind of the ways in which folks like Anthony Braxton and Joseph Jarman and those musicians talked about what Sun Ra meant to them. And for some of them, it was that his impact was less directly musical than it was what I would say cultural, in the sense that what he was really respected for was, what we might call kind of the courage of his convictions, his ability to inhabit the persona that he did and to present it to the world and to build a vehicle, the orchestra and El Saturn, to build a kind of cultural vehicle that could sustain that kind of a performance career and that kind of a sort of ongoing form of cultural statement. And even, and others, of course, have said that they were deeply inspired by him musically. And it really varies. I think, what's really interesting to me is that the AACM musicians, who also, their founders included Phil Curran, who played with Ra, but they all of them, including Curran, founded the AACM, which was a kind of music collective, on very different principles than Ra ran his orchestra. Ra's orchestra was a very patriarchal kind of institution where, Ra was the leader. And more than that, he was almost, semi-godlike in his ability to usher pronouncements and to organize his musicians musically, but also socially, and regulate their lives in ways that, in some ways, echo the traditional kind of swing band leader, but in other ways are clearly extreme. Whereas, the AACM was founded quite explicitly on democratic principles. It was a collective of musicians, but it was a collective in which everyone had a certain individual autonomy. They had to kind of give to the collective, and they had to support collective endeavors. But they also had certain kind of explicitly stated commitments to the community at large that could be balanced by, their own individual development as a musician. And so it's interesting to see both the formation and the development of the AACM, the story of which, by the way, is so beautifully told in George Lewis's book, Power Stronger Than Itself. Others have written about it quite effectively, too. But it's fascinating to see the kind of origin point of that organization and its development over time as partly inspired by, but partly a reaction to, or even a reaction against, some of what Sun Ra and his orchestra were doing in Chicago.
Sun Ra's Chicago, Afrofuturism and the City by William Seitz, published by the University of Chicago Press, is out now in paperback. For the reading this episode, musician and artist Damon Locks of the band Black Monument Ensemble will read Chapter 4, Southside Music Scene. Here's Damon Locks.
Accounts of Sonny Blount's initial years in Chicago can take on the quality of a storybook in reverse. Arriving in early 1946, he manages almost immediately to get a job with Fletcher Henderson when his idol's regular arranger falls asleep before a gig at the Club de Lisa, one of Southside's premier nightclubs. Blount, the story goes, steps in flawlessly, his musical skills and knowledge of the Henderson repertoire soon establishing him as a valued arranger and performer at the de Lisa. Henderson's departure for California 9 months later, however, brings this good fortune to an end. For the next half a decade or so, Sonny Blount scuffles for work in Chicago and at the strip club in Calumet City, unappreciated for his talents and dreaming of a better existence on Saturn. His life in Chicago becomes, in a phrase once applied to Henderson, a study in frustration, a brief taste of paradise, followed by many years toiling obscurely in a declining Southside music scene. This story, though its basic plotline may be correct, misses much of what is important about Sonny Blount's early years in Chicago and neglects many insights into the musical origins of certain Southside cultural ideals that flourished later. Blount's tenure at the DeLisa was hardly trouble-free, and his subsequent more itinerant activities, working with an array of clubs and musicians, immersed him in a generative mix of musical sights and styles. By the end of the 1940s, Blount had established himself as a key figure in the varied Southside music scene and become something of a leader for many of his younger colleagues, some of whom learned from him musically and others as a philosopher or spiritual mentor. Tracing his activities across various settings reveals how particular racial and spatial conditions affected different centers of musical production, how production at these sites addressed an array of social issues, and how one cohort of Southside musicians developed community ideals that range beyond conventional liberal notions of Black leadership and progress. Despite the racial conflicts and economic challenges reshaping Black Chicago, Sonny Blount and many of his colleagues experienced the early post-World War II years as a historical moment full of possibility.
To support Big Table, go to bigtablepodcast.org/bookshop. You can help us and independent bookstore culture at the same time. Big Table is produced and presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles, and is supported by Invisible Republic, a nonprofit arts organization based in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. You can learn more about their community-based programs and publications at invisiblerepublic.org. Big Table would not exist in the audio world without the expert skill sets, friendship, and dedication of sound designer and editor Matea Bain and audio engineer Jacob Ross. Special thanks to Eric Gorman at Gold Diggers and Alejandro Ali Cohen at Dub Lab for early encouragement and engineering prowess. Thanks again for listening.